Christmas night has a way of telling the truth. That was the night my son told me to move on. And in that exact moment, without raising my voice, without standing up from my chair, I decided I would. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This helps me know how far my story has reached. My name is Maribel Holt. I'm 68 years old. I'm a widow, a mother of one, and a grandmother of two. And for most of my life, I believed that being quiet meant being strong. That holding a family together meant swallowing discomfort. I was wrong. It was just after midnight mass at St. Raphael's Parish in Naperville, Illinois, the kind of service where the candles flicker, the choir sings too softly, and everyone walks out feeling forgiven. Snow clung to the hems of coats and boots as we crowded around the dining table in my son's house, a long oak table pushed too close to the wall to fit everyone comfortably. The smell of ham and cloves still hung in the air. Half-melted snow pooled near the entryway. Laughter came easily that night. For everyone except me. My son, Ethan Holt, sat at the head of the table, mid-40s, confident, polished, the kind of man who learned early how to sound reasonable while saying unforgivable things. Beside him was his wife, Kara, perfect posture, perfect nails, always glancing at her phone as if her life were waiting somewhere else. My grandchildren, Noel and Trevin, argued over a dessert spoon. Noel, 9, sharp-eyed and observant. Trevin, 6, still blissfully unaware of adult cruelty. Across from me sat Dennis Wycliffe, Kara's father, a retired contractor with opinions about everything he didn't pay for. My sister, Lucinda Rios, hovered near the counter, wineglass in hand, already sensing tension she wouldn't let pass quietly. And in the corner, unnoticed by most, was Jonah Pike, a family friend and church usher who had helped shovel Ethan's driveway earlier that evening. He watched everything. Said nothing. We were halfway through dessert when it happened. No raised voices. No argument. Ethan leaned back in his chair, smiled like he was offering advice, and said, "Mom, maybe it's time you move on. This isn't really your place anymore." The room froze. Forks stopped clinking. Noel looked up first. Trevin followed. Kara didn't correct him. Didn't laugh it off. Didn't even look at me. She just took a sip of her wine. I felt Lucinda's sharp inhale from across the room. Dennis shifted in his chair. Jonah looked down at his hands. And me? I smiled. Not because it didn't hurt, but because in that moment, I understood something none of them did. They thought moving on meant disappearing. They had no idea how far I was about to go. If you've ever swallowed disrespect at a family table just to keep the peace, this channel is for you. Subscribe now, or explain in the comments why stories like this don't deserve support. I stayed seated after Ethan's words settled into the room like dust no one wanted to breathe. No one clarified. Conversation eventually restarted, too loud, too forced, like a radio turned up to hide a noise in the walls. I finished my coffee slowly, folded my napkin the way I always had, and watched my grandchildren laugh at something small and silly. That was the part no one noticed. I wasn't angry. I was remembering. When Kara went back to school for her graduate degree in Chicago, it was understood, not discussed, that I would help. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I drove from Naperville to their townhouse before sunrise, packed lunches, tied shoes, and sat on the living room floor while Trevin stacked plastic blocks beside me. Kara would leave in heels and pressed blouses, coffee in hand, calling out, "Thanks, Mom, I'll be late." She always was. I never complained. I never told Ethan how tired I was. Because that's what family does. They fill in the spaces where life gets heavy. When Noel needed braces, the insurance didn't cover much. Ethan said they'd figure something out. So I did. I drove to Aurora, sat in a waiting room that smelled like antiseptic and peppermint, and wrote a check big enough to make my hand hesitate. Noelle hugged me afterward, metal shining in her smile, and whispered, "Thank you, Grandma." Kara said nothing. That was fine. Gratitude was never why I helped. Trevin had trouble forming words when he was little. Nothing dramatic, just enough that teachers suggested early intervention. So every Friday morning, I drove him to a small clinic near Oak Brook, where he practiced sounds with a patient therapist while I read outdated magazines and watched the clock. I learned his favorite snacks. I learned which words frustrated him most. I learned how small improvements felt like miracles. Those hours never showed up on any calendar. But they happened. During the 2008 downturn, when banks stopped returning calls and Ethan's job felt suddenly fragile, he came to me late one night. He didn't say much. Just sat at my kitchen table and stared at his hands. So I brought out the paperwork. My late husband, Harold Minton, had taught me to keep records, neatly labeled, carefully stored. Harold believed preparation was a form of love. He'd say, "People don't fail because they're weak, Mari. They fail because they didn't plan." We co-signed. We stabilized. We made sure the house didn't slip away. Years later, when my health was questioned, quietly, indirectly, Dr. Celeste Navarro, my longtime physician, laughed gently. "She's sharper than most people half her age," she told Ethan once. "She just doesn't feel the need to prove it." That night at the Christmas table, no one remembered those words. But I did. I looked around that table again, at the house I helped save, the family I helped raise, the sacrifices no one thought to count. And for the first time, I wondered something I'd never allowed myself to ask before: what happens when the person holding everything together finally lets go? The question stayed with me long after the plates were cleared and the coffee grew cold. I didn't ask it out loud. I didn't need to. Because the answer had already been hiding in plain sight. In paperwork, in silence, in assumptions no one bothered to confirm. There's a funny thing about houses in America. People assume ownership the moment they hang curtains, repaint walls, or host holidays. But ownership doesn't live in feelings. It lives on paper. I had seen the deed more times than anyone else in that family. Not because I waved it around, but because I kept everything. DuPage County property documents. Tax notices mailed every January. Stamped copies filed neatly, just like Harold taught me. The house wasn't given. It wasn't inherited. It wasn't theirs in the way they believed. But no one ever asked. And I never corrected them. Kara loved updates. Every few months, there was something new. A backsplash she saw on Instagram. A kitchen island that opened the space. Hardwood floors that didn't match the original layout. She documented everything. Before and after photos. Contractor tags. Carefully staged posts captioned, "Turning this house into our forever home." She never asked me what I thought. She didn't need to. In her mind, the house had already changed hands, not legally, but socially. And that was enough for her. Being on the HOA board gave Kara a certain confidence. She started using words like compliance and assessment in everyday conversation. Once, she casually mentioned that the exterior trim technically violated updated guidelines. I smiled and nodded. The HOA letters didn't come to her name. They came to mine. They always had. But she never saw them. Dennis Wycliffe, Kara's father, noticed things most people missed. A retired contractor from Joliet, he talked numbers the way some men talked sports. One afternoon, standing in line at Costco in Bolingbrook, he leaned toward Ethan and said, "You've got a lot of equity sitting there." Dead money. I pretended not to hear. But I did. He talked about cash-out refinancing like it was common sense. About leveraging value. About opportunity. The words started popping up more often. Timing the market. Always spoken just far enough away that I was meant to overhear, but not meant to respond. That was deliberate. They weren't asking permission. They were rehearsing inevitability. That January, the property tax notice from DuPage County arrived like clockwork. I opened it, reviewed it, and filed it where it belonged. I folded the paper neatly and slid it back into its folder. And as I did, I realized something important. They weren't waiting for me to move on. They were waiting for me to disappear. By the time the truth settled in, that they weren't waiting for me to move on, they were waiting for me to vanish, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. And clarity doesn't shout. It plans. I didn't announce anything. I simply began doing what I had always done best. Handling matters quietly, thoroughly, and ahead of schedule. The kind of preparation that looks like nothing until it's everything. A week after Christmas, I drove north to Evanston, the lake gray and calm beside me. I parked near a brick building just off Chicago Avenue, the office of Renee Halvorson, estate attorney. Renee didn't rush me. She didn't interrupt. She listened the way professionals do when they know someone has finally reached the end of patience. Not the loud kind. The permanent kind. We talked about structures, protections, contingencies. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. From Evanston, I drove back south and stopped at the Chase branch on Main Street. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and polish. I opened a safe deposit box under my name alone. Inside, I placed documents that had waited years for the right moment. Original deeds. Insurance policies. Trust drafts. Letters Harold had written and never mailed. Things no one else knew existed. The box closed with a soft metallic click. That evening, I called Lydia Brooks. We used to work together decades ago. Long before marriages, mortgages, or expectations. She lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico now. When she answered, her voice was warm and familiar, like a door opening. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. We talked about life. About quiet mornings. About starting again without explaining yourself. She didn't ask what went wrong. She asked what I wanted next. No one had asked me that in years. I slept well that night. No rehearsed arguments. No imaginary conversations. Just plans unfolding exactly as they should. Moving on didn't mean running. It meant choosing myself, without permission. If you're still watching, you understand this isn't about revenge, it's about dignity. Subscribe now, or tell me in the comments why people like Maribel are expected to stay invisible. Moving on quietly doesn't mean moving blindly. It means listening, to paper, to patterns, to facts that don't soften themselves out of guilt. By the time January settled into its gray routine, I had already stopped asking why things felt wrong. Instead, I asked where the proof would lead. It started with something small. A letter from a bank I didn't use often. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a statement. It was a notice. A routine confirmation about a home improvement credit inquiry, one I had never requested. My name was on it. My address was correct. The signature, however, was not mine. I didn't panic. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't ask Kara for an explanation she would rehearse. I filed it. And then I pulled everything else. Caleb Norris worked out of a modest office near Oakbrook Terrace. Former IRS analyst. Quiet voice. Sharp eyes. He didn't react when I laid the documents across his desk. He just started connecting dots. Unauthorized credit checks. Subtle timing overlaps. Loan inquiries routed through secondary lenders. These signatures, he said, tapping the page lightly, weren't sloppy. They were confident. That mattered. Confidence meant intent. There were more than one. 3, to be exact. Each pulled within weeks of each other. Each tied to projected renovations Kara had casually discussed. None authorized by me. Each one a quiet step closer to leverage. Caleb connected me with Elaine Morato, a compliance officer at one of the regional banks involved. Elaine didn't speculate. She confirmed. These checks should never have gone through without direct verification, she said. Her tone wasn't apologetic. It was serious. She opened a formal internal review that afternoon. Then came the emails. Caleb recovered a thread forwarded between Kara and Dennis. They spoke freely about timelines, about unlocking equity, about how Maribel wouldn't push back if it was framed as family. I read them slowly. Not because they hurt, but because they clarified. There was no confusion here. There was strategy. The final piece wasn't written. It was spoken. A voice recording, captured accidentally during a phone message Ethan had left months earlier. His tone was dismissive. Casual. Mom doesn't actually own it the way she thinks, he said. It's basically ours at this point. The room went very quiet. By the time Caleb closed the folder, I felt something settle. Not vindication. Not triumph. Just certainty. The story was no longer emotional. It was documented. And documents don't argue. They wait. When everything is finally laid out, there's no need to raise your voice. Facts speak louder than anger ever could. By the time I asked them to come over, the decision had already been made. The meeting wasn't for negotiation. It was for clarity. The long table in my Naperville home hadn't changed. Same oak surface. Same chairs pulled close together like they were meant for conversation, not confrontation. Outside, the snow had settled into thin white lines along the sidewalks. Inside, everything was clean, precise. On the table sat several folders. Each one labeled. Dates. Institutions. Amounts. They arrived separately. Dennis first, coat unbuttoned, hands already in motion like he was prepared to explain something away. Kara came next, eyes red before she even sat down. Ethan arrived last. Breathing fast. Already uneasy. None of them spoke at first. They were waiting for me to lead with emotion. I didn't. I opened the first folder and slid it forward. Unauthorized credit checks. I didn't accuse. I pointed. Then the emails. Then the loan inquiries. Then the audio transcript. Each page landed softly on the table. Dennis leaned back and crossed his arms. People look into options all the time, he said. That doesn't mean anything happened. I nodded. You're right, I replied. That's why we're discussing what did happen. Kara cracked first. Tears came fast, loud, uncontrolled. She reached for Ethan's arm, then pulled away. You told me this was handled, she sobbed. You said she was on board. Ethan didn't look at her. He stared at the documents like they might rearrange themselves if he waited long enough. Dennis cleared his throat. This feels like a misunderstanding, he said. No one answered him. Ethan finally spoke. His voice wasn't angry. It was afraid. Mom, we just need time, he said. We can fix this. We'll undo whatever you think went wrong. He leaned forward now. Hands open. Voice softer. Like the son he used to be. But this wasn't about tone. It was about pattern. I met his eyes. I've already given you years. The sentence didn't rise. It didn't fall. It simply landed. Silence followed. Not the awkward kind. The irreversible kind. Dennis stopped talking. Kara stopped crying. Ethan leaned back slowly, the fight draining from his posture. They hadn't lost because I shouted. They lost because I stopped explaining myself. And that's when the balance changed. When people hear the word consequences, they imagine revenge. They imagine raised voices, slammed doors, public humiliation. But real consequences are quieter than that. They arrive on letterhead. They move through systems. They don't argue. They simply close doors that should never have been opened. Within 48 hours of the meeting, the paperwork moved. Renee Halvorsen filed the corrective documents. Ownership reaffirmed. Authority clarified. Access revoked. No ceremony. Just law doing what it's meant to do when someone finally uses it. The house in Naperville was never taken back. It was acknowledged. Elaine Morado followed through. The credit lines tied to my name were frozen pending investigation. New security protocols went into effect. No calls to Ethan. No warnings to Kara. Banks don't notify people who were never authorized in the first place. They notify regulators. Kara's position on the HOA board became complicated. Monica Feldman, the association's legal liaison, requested documentation tied to the renovation permits. Missing approvals. Improper funding sources. Misrepresentation of ownership. HOA involvement escalated quietly but firmly. Committee reviews. Compliance letters. No one posted about it online. There were no announcements. But Kara stopped attending meetings. Dennis Wycliffe didn't expect scrutiny. Men like him rarely do. But patterns don't stay hidden forever. Officer Trent Holloway, assigned to the Civil Fraud Unit, contacted me weeks later. Routine questions at first. Then confirmations. Similar actions. Other families. Different properties. The same confidence. The same overreach. Dennis stopped calling. Ethan tried once more. A voicemail this time. No demands. No anger. Just exhaustion. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. It always goes as far as it needs to. That's what accountability does when it's finally allowed to work. No one went to jail. No one was dragged through headlines. No lives were ruined overnight. But boundaries were enforced. Systems responded. And power shifted back where it belonged. Justice didn't punish them. It corrected the imbalance they created. And for the first time in years, I slept without checking the door twice. There are truths children don't need to carry. Not because they wouldn't understand, but because they shouldn't have to. What happened between adults was heavy, and I refused to let that weight fall on small shoulders. I wrote the letters by hand. Slowly. Carefully. With ink that wouldn't fade. One for Noel. One for Trevin. Not explanations. Not apologies. Stories. About kindness. About courage. About how love doesn't disappear just because grown-ups make mistakes. I didn't mention houses. I didn't mention money. I didn't mention conflict. Children don't need to know where adults failed. They only need to know where they are still safe. I met with Renee again. Education trusts were set up quietly. College. Trade school. Whatever path they chose. The funds were protected. No withdrawals. No leverage. No access through anyone else. The future doesn't need permission from the past. I didn't deliver the letters myself. That mattered. Jonah Pike, the family friend from church, understood without asking. He carried them discreetly through parish channels. Slipped into backpacks, handed off with smiles after Sunday service. The children never saw meetings. They never heard raised voices. They never felt the ground shift beneath them. They saw cookies baked. Stories read. A grandmother who never disappeared. And that was intentional. If this story made you uncomfortable, it should. Subscribe, or go to the comments and tell me why accountability scares you. By the time the sun rises in Santa Fe, it doesn't rush you. It waits. That was the first thing I noticed. No horns. No schedules shouted through walls. No footsteps pacing above me, wondering what I still controlled. Just light, slowly spilling over adobe rooftops, catching dust in the air like it had nowhere else to be. That was how my mornings began now. I wake early, not from anxiety, but from habit. Coffee brewed in a chipped ceramic mug I bought at a local market near Canyon Road. The radio low. The windows open, even in winter. The mountains don't care who you used to be. They only ask if you're honest today. My days found a rhythm that belonged to me. Morning walks past galleries that weren't trying to impress anyone. Grocery runs where no one knew my last name. Afternoons spent reading, sometimes novels, sometimes nothing at all. Peace is surprisingly practical. You don't notice how much energy survival takes until you stop surviving. Twice a week, I volunteer at a literacy center just south of downtown. Adults learning to read. Parents practicing aloud so they can help their children with homework. No one there knows my story. They don't need to. All they see is someone patient enough to listen while another person finds their voice. Every Sunday evening, my phone rings. Lucinda. She tells me about Illinois weather like it's gossip. About neighbors who still ask questions she refuses to answer. About Noel's science fair project. About Trevin losing another tooth. We laugh. Not because everything is fixed, but because laughter no longer feels like betrayal. And this is what I've learned: moving on doesn't mean disappearing. It doesn't mean erasing yourself so others can feel comfortable. It means choosing peace over permission. Clarity over chaos. A future that doesn't require approval from people who only valued you when you stayed quiet. I didn't vanish. I arrived, somewhere I could finally hear myself think. Peace doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, and sometimes, it leaves things untouched on purpose. There's still a voicemail on my phone. I know it's there because the notification never disappears. One unheard message. Time-stamped weeks ago. Left at 11:47 p.m. Central Time. I never opened it. Not because I was afraid of what it said, but because I finally understood something important. Closure isn't always something you receive. Sometimes it's something you refuse to chase. The voice could be Ethan's. Or Kara's. Or someone else trying to explain too late. I didn't need the explanation. A few days later, a name surfaced. One I hadn't heard in decades. It appeared casually, in a forwarded email from Renee, buried between legal jargon and scanned PDFs. A former business associate of Harold's. Someone who had disappeared after the early years of our marriage. Someone whose signature looked familiar, too familiar. The past has a strange way of clearing its throat when you think it's finished speaking. There's also a file. Still sealed. Still untouched. Marked supplemental, not required for immediate resolution. That was the wording. Not required. But available. I placed it in a drawer and closed it gently, like you would a door that doesn't need to be locked, yet. Some truths don't demand to be known. They wait. Ethan told me to move on. He never asked where I was moving to. And maybe that's the part of the story that still hasn't caught up with him.